The building behind me is the Royal School of Mines in central London, where my great-grandfather Edward Nelson Fell studied in the 1880s.
What is
The
that?
bell, you haven't seen?
No, honestly, never.
You must have.
No, I haven't.
Okay.
Oh!
Nice little...
From 1903, the British began to take an interest in this region.
Then they found the smelting plant at Spassky and the coal mines at Karaganda, and finally the incredibly rich mine at Uspensky.
Oh, and there's some yurts. Yeah, they're beautiful.
Yeah.
The cradle of our race had been rocked under these stars. Here had our childhood been spent. Edward Nelson Fell, 1916, from the book Russian and Nomad. Saryarka, Cradle of Civilization. Trails of Edward Nelson Fell. The current of our life sometimes resembles the movement of a train. Before setting a goal, we build a path to it. On the way, we meet a variety of stations. Some of them are passing by, failing to create any impressions about themselves. Others manage to leave a deep imprint on our memory. When mining engineer Edward Nelson Fell traveled by train from London to the Russian Empire in the early 20th century, he did not imagine he would stay there for long. By that time, the map of the destinations of his travels looked very impressive. New Zealand, Great Britain, Germany, Austria, Brazil, Canada, USA. But not a single place of his work, except for the distant steppe province, was honored to be captured in his book in the huge family archive.
Karaganda, there's Spassky, and Uspensky's down here.
Oh, okay. Tell me what
Yeah.
they were doing then.
Okay, they took the ore from the Uspensky mine and the
Okay.
coal from Karaganda
Yeah.
to the smelting plant at Spassky.
Yes.
British sculptor from Cardiff, Jamie Vans and his cousin Margaret Mills are descendants of Edward Nelson Fell. For them, the family archive is an opportunity to look into the history of the family, and the book is an invitation to travel in the footsteps of their ancestor.
On the river Irtish. So they crossed that, did they?
I don't think the
No.
operation included
No. So I've never seen this before. What is
the
that?
bell. You haven't seen?
No, honestly, never.
You must have.
No, I haven't.
Okay.
Oh,
It's a nice little bell.
Okay.
And
So
it
what is
says Spassky works at 1905 to 6 on it. See there?
Oh, how gorgeous.
Oh, okay.
The ringing of this bell is like an echo of the past and an echo of old events that in an incredible way connected the fate of the steppe region and a large family from the far west, the prehistory of which began far from both Britain and Kazakhstan. New Zealand, City of Nelson. In the first half of the 19th century, the family of Alfred Fell arrived here in the British colony in search of a better life. They say the name of the ship will determine its destiny. Nelson Fell was born here in 1857. He was named after the place of his birth, as the city was once named after the hero of Britain, Horatio Nelson. He is the admiral who paved the way to his glory with courage and hard work, moving towards new goals. When Nelson Fell was 2 years old, his family returned to Britain.
And they had, oh gosh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sons and 3 daughters. No, 2 daughters, 6 sons and 2 daughters. Okay, the youngest one was Nelson.
Nelson attended the rugby school, one of the most prestigious in Britain, founded in the 16th century. Fell grew up as a lively, inquisitive, and fearless boy. Thanks to these qualities, the most unexpected meetings took place in his life. One of them was an encounter with the favorite poet of Queen Victoria. The classic of British poetry, Alfred Tennyson, known to all readers by the winged words, "Fight and seek, find and do not give up."
As a boy, on one occasion, Nelson Fell seems to have gone to the Isle of Wight on holiday. He and his brothers were out for a walk, and over the wall of a property they could see a pear tree with nice ripe fruit on it. So Nelson, being the youngest, was naturally sent over the wall to go and pick up pears for his brothers. And while he was doing that, the owner of the property came out and presumably asked him, "What's he doing in my pear tree?" And he turned out to be the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, who had retired to freshwater on the Isle of Wight. And he and Nelson made friends, and I think all the boys were invited into the house, and they had tea with Tennyson and his wife.
After graduating from the rugby school, Nelson Fell from Warwickshire went to London County to continue his studies and receive a specialty.
The building behind me is the Royal School of Mines in London, where my great-grandfather studied in the 1880s. Even in his wildest dreams, he can't have imagined that one day I would stand here, his great-grandson.
Then the future mining engineer could not imagine that after decades in search of a place in the sun, he would go to Saryarka, the ancestral home of the steppe nomads.
He was at the Royal School of Mines from 1876 to 79, and after that he went prospecting in Colorado in the USA.
There, Nelson Fell received his first skills in geological exploration. This practice did not last long. A few months later, he left for Germany to continue his studies at the Freiburg Mining Academy. After receiving additional education in Germany, the places of Nelson Fell's jobs changed as quickly as the weather in London. By that time, he had become a U.S. citizen, and he already had a family, wife Anne and 3 children, 2 daughters. The eldest is Marion, the youngest is Olivia, and a son, Nelson.
From 1897 to 1900, he was manager of the Athabasca gold mine at Nelson, British Columbia, which is in the Rocky Mountains in southwestern Canada.
Nelson Fell went to Canada with Frank Vans Agnew. He met this young man and his brother in America. If someone controls our life, then probably its best director is fate. Even in their wildest dreams, Nelson Fell and his new friends could not imagine that they would be connected not only by business interests.
Marion married my grandfather, Patrick Alexander Vans Agnew, who was a lawyer in Kissimmee in Florida. And Olivia later, much later, married Frank Vans Agnew, who was the brother of Patrick Alexander Vans Agnew.
The fate of Frank Vans Agnew is no less curious. On the advice of Nelson Fell, he studied a saying in the mining industry and started working with him. But his first specialty was veterinarian. Race horses were his hobby.
And then Frank signed up for Roosevelt's Rough Riders as well. That was in 1898, was it, when they fought the war against Mexico? And Frank didn't see any action there because he had the flu and missed out. But he became a friend of, which one? Teddy Roosevelt, the future president of the USA. and they corresponded in later life as well.
The end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. World economic architecture underwent some changes. The USA and Germany became the leaders. Britain, having lost its previous positions, was in third place. London banks at that time preferred to invest in projects outside the country.
This is Arthur Fell,
Yes.
Nelson's brother. And Arthur was very influential in the future. He became an important figure in finance and politics in Britain. And he was the one who formed the companies for which Nelson Fell worked when he went off on mining expeditions. When the opportunity came in the early 1901, they heard of the fabulous potential wealth out in the Russian steppe. Nelson Fell went to investigate what the prospects were.
This implied the development of copper smelting production with a closed cycle. By that time, Arthur Fell had already become a member of the British Parliament.
He was obviously an ambitious man and saw possibilities where other people didn't. And he was the one who formed the companies and raised the money to do the mining expeditions that Nelson Fell managed.
The route to the new project went through continental Europe and led to the east. Moscow. The life of this city at the beginning of the 20th century was gradually turning from slow pace and unhasty into more active and unpredictable. After several meetings with people who could be useful in promoting the business idea, Nelson Fell traveled to Yekaterinburg to get first-hand information about the state of mining in Russia. The situation in the Russian industry was ambiguous. Ferrous metallurgy suffered crisis. Thanks to the demand and the increase in customs duties on copper, non-ferrous metallurgy experienced more favorable situation. Nevertheless, there was high competition, which led to the collapse of small enterprises.
And they looked at any number of places. He and Frank went together and looked at any number of prospects, some of which were quite disappointing, I think.
Most likely, the first trip didn't last long, and Nelson Fell and his companion returned home. However, business ties were established.
Technical and geological drawings of...
So is this what?
Frank and Nelson Fell, our great-grandfather,
Yes.
They went and explored. I don't know really who drew the maps, to be honest.
Okay.
The second trip took place in 1903 at the end of winter. Nelson and Frank went to Omsk from Moscow on the Trans-Siberian Railway. From Omsk, the companions went to Pavlodar on horse-drawn sleighs. Frank Vans Agnew, in a book published by his great-nephew, Jamie Vans, shares his impressions. Pavlodar is a river town of a few thousand inhabitants, and the broad Irtysh flows lazily past northwards on its long journey from the Altai Mountains to the Arctic Ocean. Even here, it is at least 300 yards wide, and in winter it is frozen solid from bank to bank. In summer, a ferry plied back and forth carrying horses, carriages, and nondescript cargo, including passengers. The final destination of this trip was Bayan Aul, where work was to be done to study the potential of the Bayan Dik Kuduk mine. But all plans were interrupted by the information Fell heard. It was about the fact that the Ryazanovs, who owned assets in the copper industry for almost half a century, are ready to sell them as due to lack of funds. Mines in Karaganda, a copper smelter in Spassky, and a mine in Uspensky were idle.
And do these places still exist?
Yes, I
can
think
still
so.
go
Yeah,
there,
yeah. Well, I'm hoping so.
Yeah.
Most of all, Nelson Fell was interested in information about the Uspensky miracle mine, incredibly rich in copper ore reserves. Therefore, despite the chilly March cold and impassable roads, he made the decision to go. There were 330 miles or 530 kilometers to travel.
I think one of the most extraordinary aspects of it is how anybody finds their way across the vast expanse of the empty steppe, where there are no landmarks, and everything seems to be featureless, and yet people get from one place to another and always have managed to do so. It's extraordinary.
But the nomads, whose ancestors many centuries ago in search of pastures mastered this boundless space, have no problems with landmarks. Therefore, the travelers arrived at each point on the route at the scheduled time. The first object for studying the prospects was the Karaganda mines. From the book by Nelson Fell. There are coal deposits on vast extent, and they are often found side by side with the copper mines. The quality of the coal is not of the first class, but is a good quality of the second class. But at that time, the deposits from which the Karaganda coal was mined for the copper smelter were in a deplorable state. Their development was carried out in an artisanal way. The mining equipment was the most primitive: a wedge, a crowbar, a pickaxe, a shovel. The coal was lifted in wooden buckets using a horse drive.
And this is the actual smelting?
No, it's not. No, it's another mine, unfortunately. Bad luck.
Okay. Mm.
By the way, after a few months, information about the Karaganda coal was published in one of the London magazines. The information indicated that its ash content was 8.6%, moisture content was 3%, and the yield of volatile substances was 17%. The next point on the route to which Nelson Fell and his companion were heading was the village of Spassky, where the Ryazanov's copper smelter was located.
Near Spassky, on our first trip to Siberia.
And this one is Nelson Fell and Frank, covered in snow. Oh yeah, in a sleigh, caught in a snowstorm.
The distance from Karaganda to Spassky was 30 miles. This road, as Frank wrote in his memoirs, took 3 hours.
And Frank is very good on the distances involved. He tells you each journey he made, exactly how many hours it took, and how many hours it should have taken, and how many hours it would have taken if the horses hadn't been tired, and all sorts of details like that, which...
The foundations of the copper industry in the steppe region of Tsarist Russia were laid by the merchant Nikon Ushakov. His fate is amazing and at the same time dramatic. He was from serfs, born in the Vladimir region. He got his freedom, moved to Yekaterinburg, then in search of a better life, went to the steppe region of Siberia. In 1847, Ushakov discovered copper in the Akmola region. In the same year, he found coal. Since he did not have enough capital to build a copper smelter, he attracted Ural merchants to the project. As a result, the Spassky Copper Ore Company was created. Nikon Ushakov himself owned 20 shares. His companions, Ryazanov and Zotov, had 35 shares each. The fire in the furnaces of the copper smelter in Spassky was first lit in 1857. Saryarka Copper River, the sources of which began in the Bronze Age, continued its course. However, after a while, Zotov and Sevostyanov sold their part of the business, and Ushakov, due to the fraud of the Ryazanov family, lost everything. However, later, the Ryazanovs were on the verge of bankruptcy. They could not manage it. They had no money. They just skimmed off the top. There was no road, little money, no staff. What to do? Look for money. The Ryazanovs traveled to St. Petersburg, appealed to the government with a request for a loan, but their requests were ignored. Thus, this project attracted the attention of Western businessmen. From 1903, British businessmen began to take an interest in this region. They bought copper and coal deposits from Russian merchants to carry out a copper project in the future. While in Spassky, the partners inquired about the state of the enterprise. Compared to copper smelters, both Western and Russian, this enterprise was not efficient enough and needed modernization. But the very fact that the plant was close to the fuel source and not at a critical distance from the copper ore promised good prospects.
Well, that's a couple of reports of the which they must have had to do for the shareholders of the company to show how profitable it was all going to be and how it required further investment and all that sort of stuff.
From Spassky to the Petropavlovsk railway station, copper ingots were transported in summer carts drawn by horses and oxen, and in winter with the help of camels on sleds. This exotic, from the point of view of a Western person, mode of transport, which Nelson Fell learned about from local experts, seemed to him quite justified. Later, he noted this in his book. Horses must be fed and they have no oats. Cattle are quite useless and the camel saves the situation. He yells horribly and spits frequently while the shafts are being fastened to his shoulders. But he finally moves off and faces the storm, and with a few wisps of hay and a few pints of water, he will reach the railway in the end. In Petropavlovsk, copper ingots were loaded onto a train that went along the Trans-Siberian Railway to the European part of Russia.
So that then went 500 miles by either horse-drawn or by camel to the railway.
Wow.
And from there to Moscow to the market.
Wow.
It's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
The last point of the trip of Nelson Fell and Frank in the course of studying the potential of the new project, and in fact its initial link, was the Uspensky mine. The mine because of which they actually came to the steppe region. Therefore, they both noted in their memoirs the first impressions of their acquaintance with the Uspensky mine. Nelson Fell wrote, "Copper deposits are found over a wide area. The number and extent of them is extraordinary." Frank Vans echoes him. "We saw the huge open cut of the copper vein, a high wall 18 inches thick, made entirely of blocks of rich copper ore, all green and blue stained.
Then the different coloured bits are the same mine but at different levels, so they overlay each other.
1 inch equals 20 feet. Huh.
Okay, so this is quite a big scale map, really.
Yeah.
The knowledge gained in technical schools in London and Freiburg, as well as the experience of a mining engineer, suggested to Nelson Fell that the deposits in Uspensky were developed in the distant past. The most impressive remains of human activity are the old workings of the copper mines. These are undoubtedly exceedingly ancient and are referred by some to an age before iron was known. The business idea of the Fell brothers took on clear contours in Uspensky. There will be a copper smelting project on the territory of the steppe region. But the final decision was made in London. The only problem was how to complete the deal. A way out of the situation was found. First, a lease was drawn up with a figurehead. Then they found money to start negotiations for the purchase of the property.
Nelson's brother, okay.
Yeah. Okay, so Arthur was the person who put together the finance for the mining enterprises that he formed a consortium of businessmen to raise the money for it.
Right.
The consortium included not only major businessmen, but also politicians, including Claude-Ernest Jean Carnot, the son of the former president of France. His authority was needed to promote the project. In 1904, the Russian Emperor Nicholas II signed a landmark document. Thanks to this document, Claude-Ernest Jean Carnot received permission to use and acquire ownership of copper mines, coal deposits, and a copper smelter. These were behind-the-scenes affairs. The real actions to introduce new technologies related to the extraction of raw materials, their transportation, and the modernization of the copper smelter were carried out far from Moscow and London. This happened in the ancestral home of the steppe nomads, a meeting with whom helped Nelson Fell understand the true meaning of the words spoken by Rudyard Kipling. East is east, and west is west. Quote from the book of Nelson Fell. They are the children of the steppes, living and dying in them, as the animals do, leaving no enduring trace or vestige behind them. If you come from the Western world where man has grown to consider himself as set apart from the rest of nature, where he wages an internal war against her, where he tries to wrest her secrets from her by force, where he spends his time in what he calls the struggle for existence.
And there's some yurts. Yeah, they're beautiful, aren't they?
Yeah, in that incredibly blank landscape.
We still treasure the watercolours that my grandmother painted there and the memories of that they recorded. And that at least I hope to pass on to my children, and that's why or partly why I've gone to such an effort to transcribe Frank's letters and so on, so that any of my family will always know and remember what they did there and how much they loved it.
To understand why Nelson and Frank liked the steppe and the people living in it so much, their great-grandson Jamie has to follow in the footsteps of his ancestors. Sometimes the path to the goal is more important than the goal itself, because most of all, a person changes on the way.